August 1944. General Dwight Eisenhower faced a problem that had nothing to do with defeating the Germans. French General Charles de Gaulle was threatening to destroy the Allied command structure from within. De Gaulle demanded immediate recognition as France's legitimate leader. He wanted French forces to liberate Paris without American assistance. He insisted on veto power over Allied operations on French soil, and he was prepared to withdraw French units from Allied command if Eisenhower didn't comply. Eisenhower couldn't afford a political crisis while fighting the match, but he also couldn't let de Gaulle dictate military strategy. The supreme Allied commander needed leverage. He needed someone who could demonstrate American power without triggering a diplomatic incident. He needed George Patton. The liberation of France created political complications the Allied invasion planners hadn't fully anticipated. France wasn't just territory to be freed. It was a nation with competing visions of its post-war future, rival resistance movements and military leaders who saw the Allied advance as their chance to claim power. De Gaulle led the Free French forces from exile in London. He claimed to represent France's legitimate government, but his authority was contested by other French generals, by communist resistance fighters inside France, and by rival political factions who saw him as authoritarian. The Americans didn't particularly like de Gaulle. Roosevelt considered him difficult and unreliable. Churchill found him exasperating. Eisenhower thought he was more concerned with French prestige than military effectiveness. But de Gaulle had one advantage. He commanded French divisions fighting alongside Allied forces, and he wasn't afraid to use them as political leverage. In early August, as American forces broke out of Normandy, de Gaulle made his move. He demanded that French forces under General Philippe Clerc be given the honor of liberating Paris, not as part of an Allied operation, but as an exclusively French action. Eisenhower's staff argued against it. Paris wasn't strategically important. Capturing the city would tie down divisions needed for the advance into Germany. Feeding 2 million Parisians would strain Allied logistics. The militarily sound decision was to bypass Paris and continue east. De Gaulle threatened to withdraw French forces from Allied command and march on Paris independently. If Americans wouldn't help liberate the French capital, de Gaulle would do it himself. Consequences be damned. Eisenhower was trapped. If he allowed de Gaulle to act independently, it would fracture Allied unity. If he refused, de Gaulle might actually pull French units out of the line, creating gaps in Allied positions. Either option was unacceptable. That's when Eisenhower turned to Patton. Third Army was racing across France already ahead of schedule. Patton's divisions were approaching Paris from the south, while de Klerk's French 2nd Armored Division advanced from the west. Eisenhower called Patton to his headquarters. The conversation was brief and direct. Patton would support Clerk's liberation of Paris, but he would do it in a way that made clear who held real military power. French forces could enter Paris first for political reasons, but American divisions would secure the approaches, control the roads, and demonstrate that Allied operations ran on American logistics and American schedules. Patton understood immediately this wasn't about military strategy. It was about reminding de Gaulle who was actually in charge. August 25, 1944. French forces entered Paris to scenes of jubilation. Clerk's tanks rolled down the Champs. De Gaulle gave triumphant speeches. The liberation was portrayed as a French achievement. Behind the scenes, Patton had orchestrated something different. Third Army divisions had secured every major road into Paris before LLA arrived. American artillery was positioned to support French forces if German resistance stiffened. American logistics units were already moving supplies into the city to feed the population. The liberation looked French. The operational reality was American. De Gaulle held his victory parade on August 26. Thousands of Parisians filled the streets. French flags hung from every building. It was a moment of national redemption after 4 years of occupation. Patton attended the parade in his Jeep position where de Gaulle couldn't miss him. He wore his polished helmet, ivory-handled revolvers, and had his Third Army insignia prominently displayed. The message was subtle but unmistakable. French troops might be marching, but American power had made this moment possible. After the parade, de Gaulle demanded a private meeting with Eisenhower. He wanted more authority over operations in France. He wanted French forces to lead the advance into eastern France. He wanted guarantees about France's post-war status. Eisenhower listened politely. Then he made his position clear. Allied operations would continue under Allied command. French forces were valued partners, but they didn't dictate strategy. If de Gaulle had concerns, he was welcome to raise them through proper channels. De Gaulle bristled. He suggested that French public opinion might turn against American presence if the Allies didn't show proper respect for French sovereignty. Eisenhower's response was calibrated. He mentioned that General Patton's Third Army was currently positioned throughout eastern France. Patton's divisions were securing territory, establishing supply lines, and preparing for the drive into Germany. These operations required coordination and unified command. Any disruption would be unfortunate for everyone involved. The implication was clear. If de Gaulle wanted to play politics, Patton's army was already in position to proceed with or without French cooperation. De Gaulle got the message. The demands became requests. The ultimatums became suggestions. The threat to withdraw French forces quietly disappeared. But the real test came in September, when competing French military factions threatened to turn liberated France into a political battleground. General John de Lattre commanded French First Army in southern France. He was a capable commander, but also fiercely ambitious. D'Atre saw the liberation as his opportunity to rival de Gaulle's political influence. He began making independent operational decisions, bypassing Allied command and positioning his forces for maximum political impact rather than military effectiveness. Communist resistance forces, the French forces of the interior, were conducting their own operations and refusing to integrate with regular French military units. They saw the liberation as the beginning of a social revolution and weren't interested in taking orders from conservative French generals or American commanders. Eisenhower's staff warned him the situation was deteriorating. Multiple French factions were operating independently. Command and control was breaking down. If the situation wasn't resolved quickly, it would compromise Allied operations across the entire southern front. Eisenhower sent Patton to sort it out. September 12, 1944, Patton arrived at de Lattre's headquarters unannounced. He didn't request a meeting. He didn't send advance notice. He simply showed up with his staff, walked into de Lattre's command post, and asked to see the French general immediately. De Lattre was surprised, but welcomed Patton cordially. The two generals had a professional relationship. This seemed like a friendly visit between Allied commanders. Patton got straight to the point. De Lattre's recent operational decisions were causing problems for Allied logistics and coordination. Third Army needed roads and rail lines that French First Army was currently occupying for no clear military purpose. The situation needed to be resolved immediately. De Lattre explained that French forces had strategic reasons for their positions. He began describing political considerations, French public opinion, and the importance of French military visibility. Patton interrupted. Political considerations were not his concern. Military efficiency was. Third Army had a schedule to keep. If French forces were blocking critical routes, Patton would move them aside and continue his advance. This could be done cooperatively, or it could be done unilaterally. De Lattre could choose. The French general protested. He couldn't simply abandon positions on the orders of an American general. He had responsibilities to the French government and the French people. Patton stood up to leave. He told de Lattre that Third Army columns would begin moving through the disputed areas in 48 hours. If French forces were still there, American units would drive around them or through them, whichever was more convenient. The conversation was over. De Lattre immediately contacted de Gaulle in Paris. He described Patton's ultimatum and asked for guidance. De Gaulle, who had already learned the limits of confronting American military power, told de Lattre to cooperate. Within 24 hours, French First Army had repositioned to accommodate Third Army's advance. De Lattre's independent operations were brought under proper Allied coordination. The political maneuvering stopped, but Patton wasn't finished. The communist resistance forces still operated independently, refusing integration with regular French military command. These units controlled significant territory in central and southern France. They were well armed from Allied supply drops and had no intention of submitting to conservative French generals or American oversight. Eisenhower couldn't use regular military forces against French resistance fighters who had fought the Germans for 4 years. The political fallout would be catastrophic. But he also couldn't allow armed groups to operate independently in areas critical to Allied supply lines. Patton offered a solution. He would meet with resistance leaders personally, not to threaten them, but to explain reality. American forces were advancing toward Germany. That advance required secure supply lines through France. Groups that interfere with those supply lines, regardless of their politics or history, would be disarmed and removed. This wasn't a political decision. It was a logistical one. And logistics, Patton would make clear, was not negotiable. The meetings happened throughout late September. Patton sat down with communist resistance leaders in towns across eastern France. The conversations followed a pattern. Patton acknowledged their contributions fighting the Germans. He praised their courage and sacrifice. Then he explained that the war wasn't over. Allied forces needed cooperation to finish defeating Germany. After the war, French political questions would be resolved by the French people. But during the war, military necessity took precedence. Some resistance leaders agreed immediately. Others pushed back, arguing that they hadn't fought the Germans for 4 years just to take orders from American generals. Patton's response was consistent. He wasn't asking them to take orders. He was informing them of operational reality. Allied supply convoys would move through their territory. Roads and rail lines would be secured. This would happen with their cooperation or despite their opposition. The implied threat was obvious. Patton's army had crushed German resistance across France. Groups that interfered with Allied operations would receive similar treatment regardless of their political affiliation or resistance credentials. Most resistance leaders chose cooperation. Those who then found that American military police and French regular forces suddenly became very interested in their weapon stockpiles and territorial control. By early October, the situation had stabilized. French military factions were coordinating with Allied command. Resistance groups had integrated with regular forces or stood down. The political chaos that threatened to undermine Allied operations had been contained. Eisenhower never publicly acknowledged Patton's role in resolving the French political crisis. Official histories credit diplomatic negotiations and French internal politics, but Eisenhower's private correspondence tells a different story. In a letter to General George Marshall in October 1944, Eisenhower described the French situation as resolved through a combination of political accommodation and practical demonstration of military reality. The practical demonstration was Patton. Eisenhower had learned something valuable about coalition warfare. Sometimes political problems required military solutions, not warfare, but the credible threat of it. De Gaulle could make demands because he commanded French forces, but those forces operated on American logistics under American air cover supported by American artillery. Patton personified that reality. When he showed up at a headquarters, everyone understood what he represented. American military power, the ability to bypass political obstacles through overwhelming force, the willingness to prioritize military objectives over political sensitivities. Eisenhower used this strategically throughout the rest of the war. When French generals made unreasonable demands, Eisenhower would mention that Patton's Third Army was in the area and had operational priorities that might conflict with French positions. The demands would moderate. When local French officials tried to restrict Allied military access to resources or territory, Patton would pay them a visit. The restrictions would disappear. When resistance groups threatened to destabilize rear areas, Third Army military police would establish order. The threats would cease. Patton became Eisenhower's enforcer. Not officially, never in public, but effectively. The American general who scared German commanders served a different purpose in France. He reminded French leaders that Allied operations ran on American terms and political obstruction would be met with overwhelming military power if necessary. Patton played the role perfectly. He didn't need to threaten explicitly. His presence was a threat. His reputation for aggressive action made actual aggression unnecessary. French leaders understood that pushing Eisenhower too far meant dealing with Patton. And nobody wanted that confrontation. The mission succeeded because Patton understood what Eisenhower needed. Not diplomacy, but credible force. Not negotiation, but demonstration of power. Not political finesse, but military reality. De Gaulle later wrote in his memoirs that dealing with American commanders required understanding their priorities. Military efficiency came first, Political consideration second. Anyone who reversed that order would face consequences. He was describing Patton without naming him, the American general who silenced French rivals simply by showing up and making clear what American power could do if provoked. It was Patton's secret mission, one he executed perfectly while the world watched him fight Germans, and never knew he was also managing French politics in Eisenhower's aim.